On May 29, 1765, Thomas Romberg, who was a Highlander at Fort Loudoun, allegedly found an advertisement that had language that was designed to incite a riot. But being that Romberg said he had to copy it and destroyed the damaged original, Romberg was suspected by Justice William Smith and other frontier people to be the creator of the advertisement that caused such controversy. General Thomas Gage, the British head of military affairs in North America, and Governor John Penn, governor of Pennsylvania, were all very concerned about this advertisement. Governor Penn required the justices of Cumberland County to get to the bottom of the origin of the advertisement and called Justice William Smith and Justice James Maxwell to Philadelphia to argue their case in front of the governor in regards to their conduct and the conduct of the people of the Conococheague settlement. On July 30th, 1765, the meeting took place, and though history has lost the proceedings of that meeting, it is clear that William Smith won the argument under the civil law because of the governor's accusations levied against Lieutenant Charles Grant at Fort Loudoun after this meeting. Once again being vindicated by the governor of Pennsylvania and still able to keep his job as a magistrate, William Smith issued a writ for Thomas Romberg to get him to admit that he wrote the advertisement that caused all of these issues. Romberg never admitted to it, but looked for protection from General Thomas Gage. Meanwhile, George Croghan successfully made peace with the Indians in Ohio at Fort Pitt and down the Ohio River, despite being attacked and tomahawked in the head near modern-day Cincinnati, Ohio. These successes earned redemption for the crooked Croghan, who was still suspected by Gage and Penn to be the instigator in the Black Boys affair with his illegal trade goods. Now, since Croghan successfully ended Pontiac's war, he was a hero and could not be touched legally. These successes gave Governor Penn a reason to open trade back up with the Indians, which took away the legal argument the people on the frontier had for patrolling the roads. Eventually, they ceased these patrols and searches. Everything seemed like it was calming down. But one issue still remained. Lieutenant Grant and his Highlanders here at Fort Loudoun still had 9 guns that they confiscated from the frontier people. Private property that was seized without a warrant. Everything seemed to be going well along the frontier in November 1765. Harvest was completed on the neighboring farms. The violence had been tamped down during the harvest season. Lieutenant Grant at Fort Loudoun here still had 9 guns in his possession that he really didn't want. He was waiting on orders from his superiors on what to do with them. At first, Grant was waiting on General Thomas Gage to give him permission to return the guns. But in early October, Gage told Grant to release the weapons to a local justice once he received written approval from Governor John Penn. Now, Grant was ready to turn over the weapons because he says he approached the justices, but they did not want them. But he still had no approval from John Penn, the governor. Note that Gage created a legal way out of this mess by creating an avenue for Grant to transfer the illegally seized guns from imperial military control to the arms of the civil and colonial law. And without Governor Penn's approval, the by-the-book Lieutenant Grant still maintained hold of the guns that he illegally held. To make matters worse, General Gage, the highest-ranking British military officer in North America, decided to shutter the doors of the small forts on the frontier. He was trying to save money while the British Empire tried to recover economically from the 7 Years' War. And he felt that these smaller forts were no longer needed since the established peace with the Western Indians. Now, Fort Loudoun was one of these forts. Lieutenant Charles Grant and Blackwatch, stationed here at Fort Loudoun, were to be transferred to Fort Pitt in November of 1765. Because of the issues Grant faced in the past 8 months, the commander of Fort Pitt sent a detachment of 31 men to Fort Loudoun to escort Lieutenant Grant and the 42nd Royal Highland Regiment of Foot out of Fort Loudoun and out of the Cumberland Valley and west of Fort Pitt. Now, rumors spread among the people of the Conococheague settlement in Cumberland County that Grant and his men were going to Fort Pitt. But what of the guns? On November the 16th, 1765, as Grant prepared to leave Fort Loudoun, a man from the countryside approached the fort with news to bring the lieutenant. The man said that there were 3 parties of men waiting around the fort, ready to take Grant and McGlasson prisoner, as they heard that the garrison was going to march soon to Fort Pitt. About 7 p.m., the fort became surrounded by many armed men from the local population, and these men were led by James Smith. They fired their guns and hooted and whooped and hallooed throughout the night, just as the natives would behave, showing that the locals were using James Smith's tactics. They fired upon Fort Loudoun all night long. The next day, November 17th, more men showed up around the fort and set up camps. During the day, the firing slowed, but because of the increase in men, it was impossible for anyone to leave the fort, or for anyone to approach the fort to relieve it. Grant could not leave Fort Loudoun until the Black Boys would stop their siege. As day turned to night, the firing on the fort revved up as Grant was at his wits' end. The lieutenant was tired from lack of sleep. He was low on ammunition, and he ordered his men to hold their fire until their attackers approached the fort and tried to open the gates. As balls lodged themselves into the stockade and the side of the buildings here inside the fort, the Highlanders laid prone, waiting for the door to be breached. In the distance, the dark was cut with burning bonfires as up to 100 to 200 men kept up a constant barrage of steady gunfire onto this fort. At daybreak, the shooting stopped. The attackers sent word to Grant that they wanted their guns back. Grant, who could not find a justice willing to take the guns and was still waiting on word from Governor Penn to relinquish them to the people, refused. At 10 a.m., the Black Boys began a constant fire again. Grant and his Highlanders took cover behind walls and under furniture to avoid getting hit. The sentries on the bastions could not stand upright and hid behind the walls of the fort. That's where I'm at now, one of the bastions that is on the recreated fort structure here. One of these sentries was shot at least 3 times, and so was able to retaliate with 1 shot at the Black Boys. This was the only shot that the British soldiers were able to get off at their attackers during this entire siege. At 1 p.m., the firing stopped to allow a delegation to approach the fort to negotiate terms. The delegation was led by Justice William McDowell from the mill turned fort during the French and Indian War. Justice McDowell, who was able to stay impartial during the Black Boys conflict, suggested for Lieutenant Grant to give up the guns to him. McDowell said, "Upon a receipt, the arms will remain in my house, which has been fortified from the last Indian War, until such time as the governor of Pennsylvania would give orders about them. The owners of these guns would be satisfied on whatever the governor thought proper to do with them. Being that the garrison and Grant was very tired and weary from the lack of sleep the last 2 nights. Grant agrees to McDowell's terms as long as McDowell met certain requirements. First, McDowell had to sign an agreement that he would hold the guns until Penn directed him otherwise. Second, McDowell had to have assurances that James Smith, the leader of the Black Boys, would not interrupt or insult any person or persons hereafter in regards to this case. This was agreed upon by James Smith, who signed a contract that bound him to pay £500, which was a lot of money then, if he would harass anyone about these guns again. Grant was ready to leave the Conococheague settlement and go to Fort Pitt at this point. Though Grant did not like the deal he took, it was the best he could do without knowing when he was receiving reinforcements to help break the siege that was affecting his garrison. Unfortunately for Grant, 2 hours after making this deal with McDowell and James Smith, reinforcements arrived in the form of the 31 men from Fort Pitt. Upon receiving the reinforcements, Grant contemplated taking the arms back again by force. But being that the men were fatigued, he had no particular orders to carry the guns to Fort Pitt, and he figured the guns were safe in the house of Justice McDowell, which was formerly known as Fort McDowell. Grant decided to pack up and evacuate Fort Loudoun. A few weeks after the siege and evacuation of Fort Loudoun, Governor Penn sent a letter to William Smith that expressed Penn's opinion on Grant's actions. Penn wrote that there was no reason that there should have been so much formality used in returning the guns to the owners after the general had given orders to his officers to deliver them. Penn also wrote that it was his honor's pleasure that they be forthwith returned to their respective owners. Justice McDowell, with Penn's permission, returned the guns to their owners, fulfilling his promise to Grant. On December 13, 1765, General Gage wrote a letter to Governor Penn where he said, "If any shadow of law or justice remains in Pennsylvania, I am confident that you will leave no method untried to bring these lawless villains to condign punishment." He also referred to these villains as scoundrels called Smith and his rebel clan. On January 10, 1766, Governor Penn's council advised him to strip William Smith of his title of justice and remove him from the magistracy, since he been very negligent of his duty of upholding the law and order of the county. On January the 15th, Penn did just that, and William Smith was removed from his job. The council also advised the Chief Justice to send a writ directed to the Sheriff of Cumberland for apprehending James Smith, one of the principals and ringleaders of the rioters in the said county. By February the 10th, the writ was issued and the sheriff was on the hunt for James Smith. By March, Robert Collender expressed concern of mere rumors of the people of the Conococheague planning to attack pack horses again because William Smith lost his job and they were trying to arrest James Smith. Brighton, Wharton, and Morgan expressed Collender's concerns to the governor, who then in turn expressed their concerns to General Gage. Penn requested from Gage the use of his troops if the governor deemed it necessary to utilize the imperial war machine of Great Britain to aid the province in quelling future riots. Gage agreed to lend aid. Whether these rumors Collender heard were true or not is lost to history, but we do know that the Black Boys did not attack more pack trains in 1766. In June 1766, James Smith went into the wilderness of Kentucky and Tennessee to explore the large body of rich land westward. This was most likely to leave the Conococheague settlement while the writ for his arrest was active. On this expedition, he went with Josiah Horton, Uriah Stone, William Baker, and a Mr. James Smith from Carlisle, along with an 18-year-old black slave who was owned by Horton. This was one of the first expeditions into this area by the Anglo-Saxon race. The lead up to the American Revolutionary War found two different Americas. One was in the cities on the seacoasts, where the rich merchants and traders were upset at England for imposing unfair taxes without the colonies having a say in Parliament. No taxation without representation. Then, the other America was the people here on the frontier and in the interior. They were upset when government, specifically the British Empire in the case of the Black Boys, violated their civil rights. Taxes on commodities and such did not affect the people here on the frontier, but civil rights violations did considerably. Two different reasons to be upset at the same thing. Though they considered themselves loyal British subjects and did things in the name of the king, such as taking Grant as the king's prisoner, or singing a song that uses lyrics such as "Ye patriot souls who love to sing, what serves your country and your king." It was events like the Black Boys affair that turned the majority of the frontier against Britain in the end. Justice William Smith, James Smith, and the Black Boys were supporting British law as it existed, but the entity that was meant to uphold those existing laws was what they were opposing. It was the system that they bucked, not the actual rules as they were written. Though the two Americas didn't particularly like the British Empire for different reasons, the frontier joined forces with their American brethren when the idea of independence cropped up in the 1770s. After the official beginning of the American Revolution in Lexington and Concord, a call to arms was heard all around the 13 colonies. On May 4th, 1775, representatives of Cumberland County, Pennsylvania, met in response to this call. About 3,000 men enlisted immediately to fight for independence. Only 4,300 Pennsylvanian men in total met this call, showing nearly 70% of the initial enlistments to fight in the Revolution came from Cumberland County along the Pennsylvania frontier. Now, if you look here, this is a statue. I'm actually in Chambersburg, Pennsylvania right now. This statue is to commemorate the homecoming of James and Benjamin Chambers. Now, Benjamin Chambers, the founder of Chambersburg, or Chamberstown as what it would have been called, Benjamin Chambers is the man on the far left here. He's the old man, too old to fight in the Revolution, but previously was involved in militia efforts during the French and Indian War. His son, who had been a colonel at the end of the war, James Chambers, is on the far right, and then a 17-year-old grandson of Benjamin Chambers who shares his namesake, his name also being Benjamin Chambers. This is the homecoming of them coming home from the War. They served in Company A, the Rifle Battalion, for Pennsylvania during the Revolutionary War. These are the men who signed up immediately in 1775 to fight for independence. And these men, including at the time, who was 11 years old at the time, Benjamin Chambers the younger, would have been at the Battle of Bunker Hill and involved in all kinds of battles on this side of the Revolutionary War. Now, on December the 16th, 1773, a group of Boston men called the Sons of Liberty met to board a ship in Boston Harbor and launched a protest that would be later called the Boston Tea Party. According to one of these men, George Hughes, I immediately dressed myself in the costume of an Indian, equipped with a small hatchet, which I and my associates denominated the tomahawk, with which, and a club, after having painted my face and hands with coal dust in the shop of a blacksmith, I repaired to Griffin's Wharf, where the ships lay that contained the tea. When I first appeared in the street, after being thus disguised, I fell in with many who were dressed, equipped, and painted as I was, and who fell in with me and marched in order to the place of our destination. When it was reported that a bunch of men dressed as Indians and with their faces painted black attacked a ship in Boston Harbor and destroyed trade goods by throwing them overboard, General Thomas Gage had to be thinking, not again. The actions of the Black Boys were reported and heard all over the colonies and England itself in 1765, though there is no proof that the Sons of Liberty were imitating the Black Boys' behavior in their own protest 8 years later. It is interesting to note that the Black Boys' calling card was used successfully by the people of Boston. The Black Boys' main argument was in favor of civil law and civil rights of British subjects. When independence was declared and a new government for the new country of the United States of America was formed, these ideas were expressed and further cemented into law. The unreasonable search and seizure of personal belongings by Grant and his Highlanders was solved in the Fourth Amendment of the Bill of Rights, where warrants were required with probable cause to seize someone's property. The arrest of individuals done by the garrison at Fort Loudoun was addressed in the Fifth Amendment, where no person shall be held to answer for a capital or otherwise infamous crime unless on a presentment or indictment of a grand jury, and no one should be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor shall private property be taken for public use without just compensation. The overstep of the British military during the Black Boys affair was also addressed in the 10th Amendment, where it says that the powers not delegated to the central government would be delegated to the states and the people, meaning the local and state law would supersede the power of the larger government in these situations. What happened to the people involved with the Black Boy affair? Well, George Croghan moved to Fort Pitt, but continued to be a scoundrel. During the Revolution, he left his home at Fort Pitt and moved to Philadelphia due to Patriots' souls believing he was a British loyalist. He tried to clear his name and get clear title to his lands in the West from the new American government. He was not successful, and he died poor and unannounced just outside Philadelphia in August of 1782. He was buried in St. Peter's Churchyard in Philadelphia. General Thomas Gage sent 700 British soldiers to Concord that kicked off the Revolutionary War. He was removed from his duties and spent most of the Revolution in England. He died in England on April the 2nd, 1787. Governor John Penn was removed from influence on his family's colony of Pennsylvania when the Pennsylvanian people rewrote the Constitution of the state in 1776. After the Revolution, Penn was paid £130,000 as compensation for the remaining land of Pennsylvania that he laid claim to, and allowed to live on an estate in Philadelphia. John Penn died in 1795 in Philadelphia, in the city created by his grandfather, William Penn. Colonel Henry Bouquet purchased land called Long Meadows, located near the Long Meadows Shopping Center near Hagerstown, Maryland today, with the plan to retire there after his military service. Bouquet would serve in Pensacola, Florida, and contract yellow fever, succumbing to the fever in September the 2nd, 1765. He never got to spend time at Long Meadows. Lieutenant Charles Grant remained in service to the British Crown and fought during the Revolutionary War. After being promoted to captain in 1784, he died in 1785 at the age of 44. The 42nd Royal Highland Regiment of Foot, or Black Watch, that was garrisoned here at Fort Loudoun, left America to be stationed in Ireland. When the American Revolution started, Black Watch was brought back to America to fight at Brandywine, Long Island, and Monmouth. It existed until 1881, when it was combined with another regiment to form the Royal Highland Regiment, or the Black Watch. The Black Watch has been a British military unit since 1748 and still continues to serve the Crown of Great Britain to this day. William Smith lost his title as justice and never pursued to get it back. William Smith died on March the 27th, 1775. His estate here at Squire Smithstown was transferred to his son, who on March 17th, 1786, laid out the plan for the town and renamed it Mercersburg, Pennsylvania, after Revolutionary War hero and General Hugh Mercer. James Smith lived a long and adventurous life that was recorded in his 1799 autobiography. The events at and around Fort Loudoun only took up 5 pages of his 161-page autobiography. He went on to explore Tennessee and Kentucky, moved to western Pennsylvania, served on the Congress to rewrite Pennsylvania's Constitution, fight in the Revolution, move to Kentucky, and become a family man. During the Revolution in 1777, he and 36 of his men demonstrated the power of Indian warfare by harassing the British in New Jersey ahead of George Washington's forces. Smith's men took on 200 British soldiers and forced their retreat. In a few days, Smith's group took prisoner or killed over 35 British soldiers, showing how well his tactics worked in war. After this success, James Smith approached General Washington and suggested he raise a battalion of marksmen and dress them in Indian fashion and use the native guerrilla warfare techniques against the British. Washington, who wanted to fight a gentleman's war, did not like the idea of white men turning Indian and offered Smith a position as a major in an already existing marksman battalion. James Smith refused and went back on the frontier to combat Indians who were being paid by Britain to harass the frontier inhabitants. Though at the time the U.S. military did not embrace Smith's native tactics, today similar guerrilla warfare techniques are taught and used by our special forces and is one of the main land-based fighting styles used the most in modern warfare. In 1812, James Smith, at the age of 74 years of age, tried to enlist into the American Army to fight in the War of 1812 against the British and their Indian allies. He was denied for he was too old, but he still traveled that year with an army of 2,000 men under the command of future President William Henry Harrison. Smith was proud to see that some of his Indian tactics being used by this army in combat and travel. James Smith passed away sometime in 1812 or 1813, and most likely around or somewhere in Kentucky. As I sit here in this beautiful reconstruction of the barracks of Fort Loudoun, which has been diligently made by the efforts of the Fort Loudoun Historical Society here at the fort site, I have to wonder and have to think, this whole Black Boys thing, was it a rebellion? Even though these events were called the Black Boy Rebellion throughout history, there is a debate if it was truly a rebellion. Some have gone so far to say that the Black Boy Rebellion was actually the beginning of the American Revolution. So, what was it? The American Revolution was definitely a revolution. The definition of revolution is a forcible overthrow of a government or social order in favor of a new system. The Black Boy Rebellion was not a revolution. James Smith, William Smith, and the Black Boys did not want a new system. They wanted the British system that was already established, but was being ignored by the British military. They wanted the civil law to prevail where it should have, not the tyranny of the British military acting in force against them and in violation of their civil rights. You wouldn't blame them in their case. Just think about it. They lacked government money and help to defend their settlements from Indian attacks, but yet traders were arming those same enemies to attack them again. When they asked for the law to punish the traders, nothing is done. When the people act on this outrage to stop the traders, the government arrests them instead of the traders. Then the traders possibly get compensated by the very government that did nothing to protect the people in the frontier. No wonder they were upset. Yet still, they felt they were doing their duty for king and country. So they were not revolting against King George III yet. But these actions left a bad taste in the mouth of the colonists to later support revolting against the king 10 years later. The Black Boys' Rebellion was not the beginning of the American Revolution, but was the first shots fired at British troops by organized American colonists. An important historical significance that is often overlooked by historians and history books. But it may have been the beginning of a revolution if the dispute played out differently. Despite calls from General Gage, Colonel Bouquet, Lieutenant Grant, and others in the British military at the time, the British military did not send in a large number of redcoats to snuff out the light of the Black Boys. Neither did the Black Boys act in such a way to incite this response. Many times they had the opportunities to kill redcoats, but they refrained and showed a lot of restraint in their militant behavior. No man was killed in the Black Boy Rebellion. The British response to the Boston Tea Party in 1774 and 1775 was that of subjugation and a show of military force. If that same force was shown in response to the Black Boys' attacks on the pack train, a similar result of Lexington and Concord could have occurred to trigger a revolution here in modern South Central Pennsylvania. The question would be, would the people on the American seacoast go to support the frontier people in this scenario, as the frontier people came to support the people on the American seacoast in 1775? God only knows. If it wasn't for this bad taste put in the mouths of the frontier people during the Black Boys' Rebellion, America may not have had enough soldiers and riflemen to win the war against Great Britain. It was the tough people on the frontier that eventually won the American Revolution. The definition of rebellion is an act of violent or open resistance to an established government or ruler. This also does not describe the Black Boy Rebellion well, because they really were not resisting the political government. They sided with the laws of Pennsylvania and the laws established by the British Parliament. What they did resist against was the imperial segment of the British government, which was governed by the British military. The Black Boys started out resisting illegal trading by criminals, but it ended up as a resistance against British imperialism. The segment of British government that violated their civil rights at Fort Loudoun through military force and allowed the traders responsible for shipping illegal cargo to get away with it. Along the coasts, Americans started out resisting taxes established by the British Parliament. That eventually led to the Boston Tea Party, which then resulted in Parliament passing laws to punish Americans for that protest. Because the uprising on the coast was more directed to the laws created by Parliament, their actions were more of a rebellion than the Black Boys' actions, which was directed more to the imperial military arm of the government. But the Black Boys could still be considered a rebellion, just not one against the arm of government that makes the laws, but one against the government that was charged to uphold the laws. When 1775 rolled around, though, the distaste of the British military in the West and the distaste for British legislation on the coasts combined to create an ideology that supported revolution to forcefully overthrow all the arms of government and create a new system. This grew to become the United States of America. The Black Boy Rebellion was a lost piece of history that was significant in turning the people on the frontier against the rules of British military and eventually the British rulers. Though not the first shots of the American Revolution, it was a necessary precursor that expanded the hatred of imperial rule to the Western people of America, the very people who lived, fought, and trained for war. They were the tough people who became Washington's muscle in the form of the American Rifleman battalions. They were the people that stood up to native attackers paid off by the British, and after beating them back, turned to the coast and whipped the British to see them surrender at Yorktown in 1781. These men supported the creation of a government that would give civil law a high priority, where individual freedom was a God-given right, and it was the freedom that became the mainspring of human progress for the past 250 years. At the center of this pivotal change was the very people that opposed traitors and British soldiers in the Conococheague settlement in 1765. Neil Swanson's book, The First Rebel, expressed in a fanciful way the true story of James Smith and his Black Boys, but by doing so he helped to preserve history that was easily lost to time. It is a story so exciting and so out of the ordinary that you would think it was a work of fiction like Cooper's Last of the Mohicans, but in reality, it was true. The life and actions of James Smith was so surreal that even Smith himself recognized it when he wrote it in his 1799 biography. I was strongly urged to publish the following work, but I apprehended a great part of it would be viewed as fable or romance. No wonder they hired John Wayne to play him 140 years later. Thank you for viewing this long series of videos. It was a project, and a long one at that, but there was no other way to tell this story. It could not be done in one 30-minute video. Thank you for sticking with me on this one. I would like to thank Dan Guzzi for his research he published in his book entitled The Black Boys Uprising of 1765, and Patrick Spiro for his research he published in his book entitled Frontier Rebels. If it wasn't for this research, this story would not be told. Please also check out my other sources and check out the 1939 movie Allegheny Uprising. Please, if you enjoyed this series, please like these videos and subscribe to the channel for more. And I will see you later.